Pakistan made life so oppressive for Hindu and Sikh citizens that they left en masse. And Bangladesh continues to see a leakage of Hindus wanting to leave Bangladesh.
The saga of sustained hate attacks against Hindus in Bangladesh continues, pushing the community to the brink of an existential crisis.
If you don't take responsibility for fixing this situation, you're going to be stuck in a country that has 15% of the population feeling angry and excluded that they're not part of the national mainstream.
But I do feel that there has to be some sort of reform in society itself to sort of accommodate these things.
If you just look at the dispute over the Vishwanath temple in Varanasi, it's a nondescript local mosque that's built on top of the most holy site in Shivite Hinduism. However, the main reason India scores poorly on VDEM is not due to Eurocentric biases. The main reason India scores poorly is that...
Namaste, Professor Babones. Thank you so much for being on Bharat Varta again. The last time we spoke was a couple of years ago. We had a very insightful discussion at that point on democracy rankings and why India is unfairly treated. You have a new book out called Dharma, Democracy, and we're going to talk all about it, and also the nuances of India as a political entity, some of the social and cultural nuances as well, how that feeds into all of this. I want to start by asking, why Dharma, democracy? Why is Dharma so integral to India's democracy?
I use the word Dharma in two different ways. First of all, simply in the sense as duty. India and I think most developing countries have a much more strongly developed sense of duty of citizenship as opposed to the developed West, where most people think of citizenship in terms of the rights it gets them as opposed to the duties they owe. But in a second sense, I also meant it, of course, as the Hindu Dharma, because the fundamental thesis of the book is that Indian democracy has survived where so many other third world democracies have failed. Because of the structure of Hindu civil society in creating a unified, horizontally integrated nation within India. Thus, a Dharma democracy, not a democracy based on, a Christian democracy like you might have in Western Europe, or an individualistic democracy like you might have in the United States, but instead a democracy that was founded on a Hindu Dharma.
Right. You've spoken about this before, how in some aspects India is an unusual democracy, right? We have, $2,500 tending to $3,000 per capita income. We're such a diverse sort of a population. Every 100 kilometers, at least the superficial aspects of culture changes, the way people dress, what people eat, so on and so forth. We have so many of these languages and dialects and so on and so forth. And yet, India is a force to reckon with from a democracy electoral process perspective. We are even able to count our votes in a single day or so, right? So why do you think
is that a jab at my home country of the United States? Look, Indian democracy is very similar in institutions to Western democracies. It's a democracy on a par with those of North America or Western Europe. That's something that ironically angers many Hindu fundamentalists when I say it, because they don't want India to be a Western-style liberal democracy. And I tell them, well, I'm not here to judge whether India should be a Western-style liberal democracy. The fact is, it is a Western-style liberal democracy, to such an extent that we might even call it the dominant form of liberal democracy in the world. Because, of course, if you were to add up all the people in the world who live in liberal democracies, more than half of them live in India. So if we want to understand how liberal democracy works in practice, of course, India is only one country among about 40 or 50 liberal democracies in the world. But it is in some ways in an absolute numerical way, it is the dominant liberal democracy in the world.
Right. And yet we get the rough hand when it comes to all of these democracy rankings and so on and so forth, whether it's VDEM or, the others. Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal has done great work talking about this as well. And you have over the last couple of years. So there's greater awareness in terms of the methodology, the evaluation, and how fair or unfair some of these rankings are. What do you think they get wrong, or is it some kind of an intentional bias against India?
Sanjeev Sanyal's criticisms of the Varieties of Democracy Institute, or VDEM rankings are perfectly valid, but they are an Indian's criticism of the VDEM rankings. They're perfectly legitimate, but I'll give you an example of one of his criticisms. VDEM does not count it against a democracy if the head of state is hereditary. Now, why doesn't VDEM consider that a problem? Because VDEM was formulated and is run in Sweden. In Sweden, the head of state is not only hereditary, but must be a Lutheran. Now, could you imagine if India had a head of state who was a hereditary prince who had to be Hindu? I mean, the internet would explode with accusations of how undemocratic this is. But it's just accepted because, of course, it's always been that way in Sweden, in the United Kingdom, in Norway, in many European countries. And so it's not considered problematic. So Sanyal is absolutely correct to criticize these European biases within VDEM. However, the main reason India scores poorly on VDEM is not due to Eurocentric biases. The main reason India scores poorly is that Indian political scientists on the subjective questions in VDEM tell VDEM that India is not a democracy, that it performs very poorly. And I'll just give you one example of that. There's a lot of criticism of the Election Commission of India. Now, everybody's always unhappy with the Election Commission when they lose an election. We all know that. That's a common phenomenon. I can't tell you whether or not the Election Commission of India is unbiased. Nobody knows. We would have to actually get inside the minds of the commissioners. That said, VDEM doesn't ask, is it biased or unbiased? VDEM asks, to what extent is there a bias? Now, when we try to judge, is the Election Commission of India biased? And VDEM ranks India as being more biased in its election commission, less independent than the election commission under Hamas in Gaza. It's like, well, I don't believe that, right? Prima facie, that's ridiculous. And that's not just post the October 7th attacks. That's going back for the last 10, 15 years. They're rating Hamas-run Gaza as having a more independent electoral authority than that in India. Now, again, that's an international comparison. Then we look at intertemporal comparisons. So I know that in 1976, during the Indira Gandhi emergency, the Election Commission of India was not an independent body. And I have tons of historical evidence for that. I have Western scholars who are writing about the Election Commission of India saying it was no more than a Congress rubber-stamped body at that time, throughout the Nehru and Indira years, no more than a Congress rubber-stamped body. And that's the broadly held opinion among experts in the area. Yet again, is today's Election Commission of India a BJP rubber-stamped body? I find that hard to believe. Yet, the Election Commission of India today is rated as being much less independent than the Election Commission was in the 1960s and 70s. Okay, so as a quantitative social scientist, I'm looking at these intertemporal and international comparisons and saying that the Indian political scientists who give VDEM their subjective evaluations, they have to be wrong. Now, what the proper answer is, I can't tell you. All I can tell you is prima facie, the current evaluation that the Election Commission of India is far less independent than in the 1960s and early 70s and is less independent than in Gaza, that's a prima facie ridiculous assessment. Now, multiply that repeatedly through multiple indicators, and again, focusing on the subjective indicators, which the more subjective the indicator, the worse India tends to do. That leads me to the conclusion that there are really serious biases embedded not in the VDEM system itself, but biases embedded in the college of experts that VDEM reaches out to. And I'm willing to bet you that Sanjeev Sanyal is not one of the experts that VDEM reaches out to evaluate India on its democracy.
Yeah, and it's not just democracy, right? I mean, whether it is happiness or freedom of expression and so on and so forth, on a relative scale, I mean, we kind of...
Yeah. So the most amusing is World Press Freedom, the Press Freedom Index, the World Press Freedom Index produced by Reporters Sans Frontières, which is an activist journalist organization. And you just think, who in India would be a member of Reporters Sans Frontières? I mean, the leading reporters at the top newspapers and news channels, I really doubt go to Reporters Sans Frontières, which is a radical, activist organization, and become members and want to talk about India. On the other hand, if you're at an activist website, you become a member. Any journalist can become a member, and then you answer the survey saying how terrible press conditions are in India. Very noticeably, on the Press Freedom Index, the countries that score the best tend to have almost entirely state-owned media. Ireland, Denmark, Norway, New Zealand, for that matter, countries where most journalists have a job for life with relatively easy workloads, with guaranteed vacations, all at government expense. Yeah, that's a great country for journalism. Now, I don't believe that, right? It lacks face validity that India, which does have problems with freedom of the press, every country has problems with freedom of the press, that India, which has very minor complaints. I mean, the biggest complaint I hear about freedom of the press in India is that the Adani group bought NDTV and changed its political stance. Now, is that good for freedom of the press? Probably not. I don't know. But if I go to the United States, ABC is owned by Disney. If I go to here in Australia, the Australian and Sky News are owned by the News Corp, the Rupert Murdoch news organization. I mean, it may not be the perfect arrangement. Yes, I would love to see every major newspaper be in the hands of a not-for-profit trust that only cares about the reader. But that's not how the media works. And India's problems are fairly typical. The sorts of complaints I see about the Indian press are fairly typical of the complaints you hear around the world. Spending a lot of time watching Indian media, I can tell you India actually does better than most of these others, because in the US and Australia and Western Europe, if you have a panel, it'll almost always be people who are all on the same side of issues.
Right.
On Indian TV, it's very frustrating. You get these 8-person panels where every point of view is represented. And even if the channel itself has an editorial position that might be pro-BJP or anti-BJP, there will always be people from other sides, plural, multiple other sides on the panel. So I think India in many ways is better served in terms of diversity of opinion that realistically makes it on air, on television news or in print, in the print media. India does much better than most other countries. Yet that's not reflected in the Press Freedom Index rankings.
I think what some people fail to grasp is the sheer diversity of media that we have in India as well. Whether it's at the national or state level, people tend to look at, let's say, Republic or now NDTV or CNN and tend to think that that's all of Indian media. But really, I mean, if you look at the states and so on, I mean, there's fair amount of criticism, right? And the newspapers, though, whether it's Deccan Herald, the Hindu, even the Times at times, I mean, they do carry like very harsh critiques of the government, on half a page op-eds, no less, right? So there is a lot of critique for sure.
Well, there's enormous variety. Now, I only watch the national English language media. Even among the national English language media, there's incredible diversity, even to the point where TV news channels that are perceived to be pro-BJP, broadly speaking, in their outlook, will still always ask the question on the other side. They'll always have guests on the other side. Now, that's not something you see in Australia. I mean, in Australia, ABC, which is government-owned media, they, for the most part, only have commentators and guests who are on the broadly labor side of politics. And Sky News, which is the News Corp-owned outlet, they pretty much only have columnists and guests who are on the conservative, the Liberal Party side of politics. That's not true in India. I mean, even when a news channel has an identifiable political stance, it hosts guests from the other side. And my experience, and again, of national English language media, I don't have access to the Hindi media, to the regional language media, but at least the national English language media in India, in my experience, is far more diverse than that of any other English-speaking country with which I'm familiar. It really is amazing how diverse the Indian media is. And Indians can't comprehend this, that if you go to a country like New Zealand, which is ranked generally in the top 5 in the world for freedom of the press, there's only one TV news channel and it's owned by the government. And that's there's only one major national newspaper. literally one. And if you can't get your opinion in that newspaper, you can't publish your opinion. In India, there's always a newspaper to suit your politics. And that's just not true in most of the countries that are ranked best in the world for press freedom.
Right. You mentioned the core problem is, of course, that the intellectual class in India is somewhat avowedly anti-India, right? I mean, that's where a lot of the sampling as well, the bias kind of skews one way or the other, right? I mean, do you see that? Do you see that changing over the last 5 to 6 years that you have been interacting with people?
Well, look, so first, I've been taken out of context there. In that, I know it was a very viral moment, but saying that it's India's intellectuals are anti-India was not a statement of fact. It was an explanation for the low rankings of India. And I was trying to explain to people, those low rankings did not come from Sweden.
That came from
It's not a bunch of Swedes who were sitting down evaluating India. It was a bunch of Indians who were evaluating India. Now, if I say that the intellectual class as a whole is anti-India or critical of India, or the ones who are presenting the bad assessments about India, that would be true if I was talking about Australia or the US or any other country. Intellectuals tend to be very critical of the societies that they are in. The difference is that we don't necessarily take those intellectuals at face value when we're talking about other countries. If we were talking about, well, if I were to look to the United States and you were to take American intellectuals at face value, America is now a Trumpian dictatorship where rule of law has ceased, where opposition politicians are routinely prosecuted, where the media listens to the whims of Donald Trump, taking people off the air. And we are bordering on fascism. I mean, the number of times fascist is connected to Donald Trump is extraordinary. There's no shortage of evidence. If I wanted to quote intellectual after intellectual, the two most famous American experts on fascism from Yale University left the country and went to Toronto because they said they feared for their lives, just as Jewish intellectuals in Nazi Germany feared for their lives, and they fled the country. Now, no one takes that seriously. I mean, even if you don't like Donald Trump, no one really believes that he will stay in office after 2028. No one seriously believes that there will be no more elections in America. Nobody seriously believes that American democracy is ended. And in fact, if I were to look at one of the major democracy rating indices, the Polity 5 database, which before VDEM was the standard academic democracy database, they now rank America. It's an American database. They now rank America below Putin's Russia. Okay. Incredibly, right? I mean, I could write an academic paper with full citable evidence that major academic authorities have said that the U.S. is now a fascist state, and the major quantitative democracy evaluation body in the United States now says the U.S. is worse than Putin's Russia. But who would take me seriously? No one would take me seriously. And that's the difference for India. No one would take me seriously because all of you know America. You've been to Disneyland. You follow the U.S. news. If I open up any Indian newspaper app, I'll see of the top 10 stories 4 are about America. Indians are incredibly well informed about the United States. And so when a US-based academic democracy evaluation agency rates America worse than Putin's Russia, it's not even news. Nobody even knows it happened because you don't take it seriously. On the other hand, when the Varieties of Democracy Institute ranks India number 105 in the world, well, an American or an Australian journalist writing about India, they don't know anything about India. They've heard of Narendra Modi. They haven't heard of anybody else in Indian politics. They don't follow Indian elections. They don't read the Indian news. They just are writing a report. Narendra Modi is visiting the country this week. Well, we need to get some data. We look up Varieties of Democracy Institute. India is now an electoral autocracy. Narendra Modi is an authoritarian dictator, and India is one of the worst democracies in the world. And that becomes the truth. It becomes the truth because the journalist doesn't know enough to question it. All of you know enough to question these ridiculous evaluations of the United States.
Right.
And so you don't take it seriously. We take the VDEM ranking seriously, and not only we do, the other rankings do. So the Economist Intelligence Unit does a democracy ranking. They rank India relatively better. It's around 48, I think, in the world. But their India ranking has been declining because they read VDEM. The Economist Intelligence Unit has some experience of India, but they have to hedge their bets. After all, they read the news, and the news says India is now one of the worst in the world. And so since VDEM started downgrading India, the Economist has followed suit with a lag of a few years because we just don't know India.
Right.
Researching the book, I mean, I've spent 6 years reading 4 Indian newspapers, lots of Indian websites, watching Indian television, watching Indian comedy, and trying to get a feel for what are things really like in India. Yes, I have the quantitative data, but also just my impression from the last 5-6 years of research is all this criticism of India is wildly overblown.
Right. There's a bit of a squeaking noise in the background. I'm not sure what that is.
Those are our lorikeets. It's sundown. It is just right now sundown in Australia, and the lorikeets come visit the balcony. They're begging for food.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, that's okay.
I'd turn the video and give you a peek, but it's everything is wired up.
No worries. I just wanted to be sure. Okay. You bring up an interesting point, which is that when you look at India from a Western lens, there are quite a few non-translatables. For instance, Dharma, you mentioned, doesn't really translate to religion per se, right? And
I translate it as duty, and I rely on Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, the second president of India, and the professor of Eastern religion at the University of Oxford. I don't know if Indians realize that. Dharma is duty. It's a specifically Hindu conceptualization of duty, but nonetheless, it's a sense of duty.
Duty, principles, one would even extend and say like, okay, these are moral rights and so on and so forth, right? But what I mean to say is that when you look at India from a Western lens, I mean, there are so many of these non-translatables, so many things that just don't fit, right? I mean, for instance, you mentioned, here we have this concept of responsibilities over rights, right? There is no concept of a separation of church and state because Hinduism is not like a very centralized monolith sort of a thing, right? So for someone studying India from the outside, how do you go about doing it? How do you sort of recognize all of these different nuances? What were your references and so on?
I had to inform myself and then inform my audience because the book is written mainly for a Western audience. So the second chapter of the book focuses on Yogi Adityanath. Yeah. And I chose to focus on Yogi Adityanath because he is not translatable, as you say. Narendra Modi, he could happen anywhere in the world. Someone who comes from a modest background, who goes to correspondence school, gets involved in a national service organization, the RSS, and ultimately works his way up to become Prime Minister of India. That's not a specifically Indian story. Yogi Adityanath is a specifically Indian story. To literally be the head of a major religious order while being the chief minister of a state of 200 million people, that can't happen in any other democratic country. And so I try to explain in the book, and looking at the data on this, well, how is that possible? Well, if you compare India to other major liberal democracies, primarily Western liberal democracies, India is far more religious, far more traditional. If you ask Indians, is it your responsibility to care for your parents? Over 95% agree. If you ask if you ask Indians, how important is religion in your life? 98% will say very important. Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Jain, it doesn't matter. 98% will say it's very important in their lives. So the ultimate explanation for Yogi Adityanath is not that the Indian system is different from the Western system. It's that the Indian electorate is different from the Western electorate. And so an Indian electorate can accept a literal yogi being a chief minister in a way that a Western electorate could not accept, the Bishop of Philadelphia becoming the governor of Pennsylvania. It's comical even to think about it. And that's really taking the systematic data, going to the survey data on India and using that to explain or to construct an explanation as to why India produces different outcomes is, for me, the heart of doing social science. That is, I don't want to impose I don't want to impose my understanding from Western democracies onto Indian democracy. I want to understand Indian democracy in its own terms. And that's what led to the fundamental theoretical breakthrough of the book, which is all about the structure of civil society. The standard theory of democracy, and this isn't my theory, this is what you would learn if you took Political Science 101.
Right.
A standard theory of democracy is, in Western European countries and in the United States, a rising middle class demanded independence from churches. They became secularized, and they formed associations outside of religion and outside of government that we call civil society. With the result that in the West, civil society is almost defined as excluding anything religious. Okay, a church is not a civil society organization. A bowling league is the classic example from Robert Putnam, is a civil society organization, or a union, or a lodge, or an art club. Anything where people get together outside of church and state. Now, why outside of church and state? Because in the West, both church and state are hierarchically constructed. Well, in India, churches are not churches. Religious organizations are not vertical hierarchies. Religious organizations are much more horizontal. And I use the example, in the West, if you're a Presbyterian, you can't be a Catholic. If you're a Catholic, you can't be an Anglican. If you're an Anglican, you can't be a Baptist. Each of these churches is a separate vertical silo that puts people into categories and separates them, with the threat that if you have a democracy, well, the Baptists and Lutherans will ally against the Catholics and Anglicans and divide your country. And that's the big threat of democracy, is that people will divide in identifiable silos. In the Hindu faith, however, people are not divided by sect. People can and do worship at multiple temples. They worship at home. They celebrate each other's festivals. Every religious festival, even a festival like right now, Navratri. Navratri is not the same festival in different. Now there is a Navratri festival all over India, but it's a different festival all over India. Yet people accept each other's constructions of Navratri. They have different names for it. They have different meanings of who Durga is and what, whether it's a Durga they're celebrating or some other goddess they're celebrating, yet they all celebrate each other's festival. That creates a horizontal linkage. The Hindu faith doesn't divide people by sect, because many Hindus belong to multiple sects. You don't have a membership card for which sect you are in. Right. As a result, civil society in India grew out of the Hindu faith. Most civil society organizations in India are either thoroughly Hindu in orientation, and I mean even labor unions, farmers' organizations, or they're in a separate Muslim civil society. And again, they're uniting around their Muslim faith across India. But the primary organization is these Hindu-based civil society organizations. And Western theorists, Western democracy theorists, have been blind to this, because in their own theoretical model, religion means not civil society. So in my mind, India follows a standard pattern. A very dense network of civil society organizations saved Indian democracy from the kinds of problems that arose all throughout the third world. But a Westerner looks at it and says, oh, there's no civil society in India, which is crazy. I mean, India's full of associations. It's such an associational country, yet a Western political scientist simply doesn't see it, because those associations overwhelmingly are somehow religiously affiliated.
That's an amazing point. You brought up these different traditions and what we call sampradayas. They can be within the same house. There could be different strands of worship.
Sure.
For instance, right? I mean, the mother could worship
Sure.
Devi, and someone else could worship Shiva, and so on and so forth. There are distinct paths, but we do believe that there is like a commonality in all of these things. in all of these different practices and so on and so forth.
Not only
One,
that, but worshiping Lord Rama does not prevent you
yes,
also worshiping Lord Shiva,
yeah,
right? There's no either or about it. Now,
absolutely.
but if you're a Presbyterian, and we literally have the term in communion, that is in community with the Presbyterian Church, you cannot be in communion with another church.
Mm.
And that's symbolized by the fact that all the churches hold their services at the same time, 10 a.m. Sunday morning. Because, of course, you're not going to go to one and then go to the other and then go to the other. You choose which church, and you're only in one. With the result that in the West, civil society had to emerge outside the church, whereas in India, there was no barrier to civil society emerging within the temple.
Right. One of the important distinctions that you draw out is the difference between the nation and the state.
Yeah.
And in India, you say that everyone is collectively behind the state, right? Whether it is through the electoral process or, let's say, being invested in the laws and the constitution and so on and so forth. But in the when we talk about the nation specifically, right, there is sort of a Hindu or a dharmic strand
Yeah.
to the nation, right, which is not reconciled by all sections of the society. And here, more specifically, we talk about, let's say, the 200 million
Yeah.
Muslims in India who practice the Islamic faith, right? And you also speak quite a bit about how it's important to sort of integrate these folks into the fold. Do you have some ideas in terms of what could work?
The idea of the nation is an amorphous one, right? There's no definition of what forms the nation. But in practical terms, a nation is a group of people who consider themselves to be part of the same nation, who share the same symbols, as John Stuart Mill put it, who share the same history, and not the actual history, who share the same idea. He called it literally a community of recollections. So if you're all looking back to the Mahabharata war, and that's the community of recollections that defines India, well, what place is there in that community of recollections for a Muslim Indian? And at the same time, at different times in modern India's history, different groups have been excluded. I mean, there were times when Sikhs in India suffered serious pogroms, being identified as external to the nation after the Indira Gandhi assassination. Sikhs faced terrible political violence. And even today, there is, of course, Khalistani separatism, not so much in India, but very much in the Indian diaspora in Canada, of Sikhs trying to claim they're not included in the Indian nation. So it's not just Muslim Indians. At different points in history, it's been Sikh Indians. At some points, if you go further back, Dalits, and under Ambedkar, claiming that Dalits were not being fully included in the Indian nation. So these cleavages of people not feeling included in the nation are the main way democracies fail. And to understand that, all an Indian has to do is look left or right at Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Yeah.
The Punjabis in Pakistan could not accept a Pakistan that had a majority of Bengali voters. And so when the Awami League won the election in, 1970, they imposed martial law on East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh, because the two groups didn't feel like they were part of the same national community. Nations break down on this basis of divisions where people don't feel they're part of the same national community. Well, in India, there are these problems still. The integration of Muslims in the Indian nation is a challenge, because what does the Mahabharata war mean to them? Or I'll put it, to get away from self-conscious Hindu nationalism, to get away from the BJP and Narendra Modi, let me give the example of the Congress Party. If you look at Rahul Gandhi, and he had the Bharat Jodo Yatra, right? Well, that's a very Hindu-centric language, Bharat, the Yatra. He didn't call it an India unity march. That would be purely, a religious, purely secular language. He certainly didn't call it a Hindustani Ummah Hajj, right? I mean, now, if India were, if he were Muslim, he could have called it Hindustani Umahaj to bring together Indians. But of course, that language would never occur to him and never be acceptable in India. So even for the Congress Party, which portrays itself as the guardian of Indian secularism, still adopts Hindu-centric terminology, Hindu-centric imagery. When the Congress Party wants to appeal to the broad Indian electorate, it adopts a Hindu-centric language. But how should a Muslim Indian feel about that? How should a Christian Indian feel about that? How should an atheist Indian feel about that? It's not clear. And it's a potential problem for full social inclusion of non-Hindus in the sense of the Indian nation. And before, I know you must have a lot of things to say. This is not a problem that's unique to India, right? When Donald Trump goes to Charlie Kirk's memorial service and talks about America as a Christian country and uses Christian imagery, again, what place for non-Christians in that conceptualization of the nation? Or when Angela Merkel, the former chancellor of Germany, who's herself the daughter of a Lutheran pastor, talks about Muslims not fitting in Germany because Germany is a Christian country. And she said that, and it's in my book documented. Well, what place for Muslim Germans? And there are a large number of Muslim Germans. So it's not a problem that's unique to India. This is a challenge that all democracies face, of making everybody feel that they're part of the same national community.
Right. I think the difference, though, is in the scale. Right. We have 200 million Muslims.
But 200 million is 14%. Right.
Yes.
It's not the sheer number. It's the proportion. And those proportions are similar to minority proportions in other countries. It's not out of kilter with other countries. Yes, 200 million, but to say that African Americans make up 14% of the U.S. population, and African Americans face much more severe poverty statistics, educational disadvantage than Muslim Indians.
Yeah.
And so there's this challenge of, how to include the African American minority in the American nation. That's been a challenge that's been going on ever since the end of slavery.
That would be on the racial lines, and here it's more on the religious lines per se, right? But we also have the hangover of partition, right, which was so bloody. 5 lakh people are more, more than that, in fact, displaced, and many lives lost, and so on and so forth. And of course, the fact that there was no true population exchange at that point of time, right? So you have a significant portion of Muslims living here in India, and so on. So sometimes, you often wonder, how these ideas can ever be reconciled, right? Because you can't go back to history and kind of set things right in some way. Right. At the same time, you have to take all of these folks along and move into the future if you have to really progress as a country and a state.
Yeah, look, partition was obviously a human tragedy, but also an intellectual disaster. There was no rationale for partition. Rajendra Prasad, B.R. Ambedkar, Jawaharlal Nehru all wrote books explaining that partition would just leave India, the remaining India, with a large Muslim minority. All partition did was create areas that had Muslim majorities so that Jinnah could win an election. Right? And that's really all it came down to. And my final analysis of partition is Muhammad Ali Jinnah wanted to be father of the nation, and he knew, and it infuriated him, that Gandhi was going to become the father of the nation. And he had no respect for Gandhi. He reviled Gandhi. And if Gandhi was going to be the father of the nation, Jinnah would just found a separate nation. And I think that's ultimately what led him to go all in on the Pakistan idea, which was intellectually bankrupt. Everyone at the time recognized it was intellectually bankrupt. It made no intellectual sense, but it happened, and it was a terrible human tragedy. And accounts differ, but maybe up to 1 million people lost their lives. It really is a horrific episode in world history. That said, it happened. It's done. Nehru did not want an exchange of populations. Whether an exchange of populations was ever possible is questionable. Of course, India was never going to do what Pakistan did. Pakistan made life so oppressive for Hindu and Sikh citizens that they left en masse.
Right.
And Bangladesh continues to see a leakage of Hindus wanting to leave Bangladesh. If India would accept Bangladeshi Hindus, it's likely that 90% of them would move to India, tomorrow. But India, I mean, even if there was an acceptance on Pakistan to exchange populations, even if Nehru, instead of resisting the exchange of populations, even if Nehru had endorsed it, would you want your country to have had pogroms against Muslims to convince them to leave? Would you have wanted your grandparents to have raped and murdered their Muslim neighbors to convince them to go? Well, in Pakistan, they did, right? I mean, there's a reason Lahore has no Sikhs. It's because the Sikhs who were in Lahore were, horrifically attacked, and they had to leave. I don't think even if Nehru had agreed to an exchange of populations, I doubt that most Muslim Indians would have left the country because they didn't want to leave. Most of them didn't even want Pakistan. So in a way, it's just a non-starter. I mean, unless you want your country to have been as bad as Pakistan, which hopefully you don't, then one way or another, there was going to be a large Muslim minority in independent India. There are no two ways around it.
Well, before people lynch me in the comments, it's 12 to 20 million people displaced. I mean, the 5 lakh number was wrong.
I'm sorry not to correct you, but I don't do lakhs in my head, so I thought it best. I still have to go to the computer.
So, you also mentioned one important thing, right? That the Muslim intellectual class during partition, all of them or most of them migrated.
Overwhelmingly left.
And
in the book, we have data on that. In the book, there's data on the number of Indian administrative service, or Indian at the time, Indian civil service and Indian police service. Indian political service officers who left India for Pakistan. Not only did nearly all leave, even those who came from states that remained in India. So even those from Kerala and Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, they almost to a person left to go to Pakistan. So it wasn't just the Punjabis and the Bengali Muslims who left to go to Pakistan. It was the entire intellectual class who left to go to Pakistan, with the leaving Aligarh Muslim University as this lonely outpost remaining in India when the rest of the intellectuals left. And throughout the late 1940s and the 1950s, if you read Indian newspapers, you'll see advertisements for well-off and highly educated Muslims looking for a ticket to Pakistan. Right. Saying, "Oh, I'm an engineer. I'm happy to work with the company," and you can see these literal personals ads of people wanting to go. The people who didn't try to leave are the ordinary farmers, workers, ordinary Muslim Indians who I don't know whether they wanted to leave or not. I don't have a crystal ball to look into the minds of people from 1945. But whether they wanted to leave or not, they didn't leave. And their children are in India, and their children and grandchildren, from all the survey evidence we have, are very proud and patriotic Indians who have no thought whatsoever that they would like to leave the country, unless maybe they get a ticket to London or New York, but certainly not to leave the country to go to Pakistan or Bangladesh.
Right.
And I'm sorry, can I just add something? One of the really interesting things we hear constantly about how anti-Muslim India is, and we're bombarded with this in the West. And yet an interesting fact is there's massive Muslim in-migration into India and no measurable Muslim out-migration from India. So the India-Bangladesh border is relatively porous. Yeah. And it's, of course, a political issue in India, the several million Muslim Bangladeshis who live illegally in India. Yet there are virtually no Muslim Indians who live illegally in Bangladesh. And it's a perfect comparison because India and Bangladesh have the same GDP per capita.
Right.
So it's not a matter of people coming to India because India is so much wealthier than Bangladesh. No, it's just Muslims from Bangladesh systematically desire immigration to India, whereas Muslims in India seem to have no interest whatsoever in immigration to Bangladesh.
You've also referenced the Pew surveys at one point of time, right?
Yeah.
That that often say that if you were to poll Muslims, they feel safe, they feel protected, they don't feel very discriminated here, and so on. And
they report very low levels of official discrimination.
yeah, very low levels of discrimination. But the fact that all the intellectual class moved meant that the power got consolidated with the religious sections of the Muslim society, right, which is like all the mullahs and so on and so forth. So is that why you see such a pushback against something like a uniform civil code, for instance, right, which is in principle that the same law should apply to every person in the country irrespective of one's faith? Do you see that as a fissure as well? I mean, do you think that we can ever sort of consolidate and move forward on that front?
Look, it's a serious problem for the Muslim Indian community that there's a lack of intellectual leaders of non-religious authority intellectual leaders in the community. So if I were to just ask you, to name the top 20, Hindu figures in India, or most influential Hindu figures, you probably wouldn't come up with a lot of clerics. Yeah, Yogi Adityanath, but you wouldn't come up with a lot of godsmen, as you might say. You have not many. But if you were to list the top 20 influential Muslim advocates in India, you'd have a lot of people who are associated with the Muslim Scholars Association and with religious institutions, and that is really telling. That the question who speaks for Muslim Indians is a difficult question. Now, of course, everybody speaks for themselves. In a democracy, you go to the polls, you vote for yourself. But who speaks for Muslim Indians when it comes to the Uniform Civil Code? Well, the people we hear speaking are overwhelmingly religious authorities. And we're not hearing from non-clerical Muslim civil society leaders because there are just too few of them. Even today, 78 years after independence, we're hearing too few of those voices. And that's a structural problem in the Muslim community in India. It's one that's not easily solved. It's one that I recommend that Hindu Indians try to play a role in helping solve, in that I've repeatedly told Hindu Indians if they want to reduce Muslim social exclusion in India, they should be inviting Muslims into their own organizations. And I've heard pushback from Hindu Indians saying, well, it's not our responsibility. Like, well, it's not your personal responsibility. Is it your national duty? Is it your Rashtra Dharma to be more inclusive, to help foster the creation of a Muslim civil society? I think that would go a long way towards improving India. I mean, the first place where many Indians will have heard of me was when I spoke at the India Today conclave in Mumbai. And I had the interview with Rajdeep Sardesai that went viral. And one thing I did in that interview is I pointed out, Rajdeep is a thoroughly secular journalist. India Today is a thoroughly secular, progressive news organization. And I pointed out to them, I had been at the conclave for 3 days. I was in the final day of my speech or my interview. I had only met one Muslim Indian at the India Today conclave. I'd met dozens of people. I'd met Parsis, I'd met Sikhs, I'd met, of course, Hindus. I'd only met one Muslim Indian. And I said, even India Today, which views itself as a progressive, secular organization, wasn't consciously trying to be inclusive of Muslim voices in its conclave. Now, is it their responsibility? Again, that's for Indians to think about. It's something that, quote unquote, affirmative action has a bad name in many circles. But the fact is, if dominant organizations like India today, a dominant media organization, if they don't make the effort, then the only venue through which aspirational, ambitious Muslim voices, the only institutions through which they can rise and become spokespeople, will be the mosque.
And here again, I mean, I'm voicing the opinions of quite a lot of fellow countrymen when I say this, that is it also a problem because like Islam or Muslims are fundamentally exclusionary, right? Because they don't have they've not had the enlightenment per se, right? I mean, so it's not like, India hasn't tried to integrate these various strands of society, but it's just that fundamentally, right, there is this concept of a kafir, the other, the zimmi, and so on and so forth. You again couple that with about 600, 700 years of Islamic rule in India, and so on. It's a lot of baggage to move around in a way that suits the sort of prescription that you're providing.
So there's a difference between blame and responsibility.
Right.
Is it Muslim institutions' fault? Yes, it's Muslim institutions' fault. I mean, it's the fault of Jinnah and the Muslim League that India was partitioned. It's the fault of Muslim intellectuals that they chose to go to Pakistan. It's not the fault. I don't blame Hindu Indians for creating this situation. But I do say that to Hindu Indians, if you don't take responsibility for fixing this situation, you're going to be stuck in a country that has 15% of the population feeling angry and excluded that they're not part of the national mainstream.
No, it's definitely our responsibility for sure. I think everyone's responsibility to make sure that every Indian feels like, feels that sort of nationhood per se, and nobody should be excluded. But I do feel that there has to be some sort of reform within society itself to sort of accommodate these things, right?
It would be a big benefit. Now, look, somebody has to reach out a hand first. I know hands have been reached out many times by many people. People have to keep doing it if they want to live in a pleasant country. Again, I've told Muslim Indians that if you just look at the dispute over the Vishwanath temple in Varanasi, it's a nondescript local mosque that's built on top of the most holy site in Shivite Hinduism.
Or Babri temple.
The Babri Masjid has now been settled, right? So, and that was settled badly. The proper settlement for the Babri Masjid was not that a Hindu mob should tear down the mosque and then the Supreme Court should make a decision. The proper answer in both of these cases was that the Muslim authorities in these local towns should have said, we understand how much this site matters to our Hindu brethren. We're willing to sell it. We'll have an appraiser give a fair market value, and we'll sell the site, and we'll build a mosque next door, and everybody will celebrate. And could you imagine and again, I don't know specifically what Muslim organization is in charge of the Vishwanath temple, but could you imagine if that organization just sent out a public press release saying, we're really sorry about all this trouble over the last 150, 200 years. We want to solve it. We'll sell the site for a fair price, move next door, and have a joint festival at the opening. They would be feted as the most popular people in India, right? This would do more to advance Muslim Hindu unity in India than anything in the past 100 years. Anything Mahatma Gandhi ever did would be overshadowed by this one gesture. And I've gone on record in the book. I write it in the book. I've gone on record speaking that, Muslim Indians should be thinking about, could we do something symbolic that would show Hindu Indians that we want to be, now legally, the Muslims in Varanasi have every right to pursue their case in the courts. And legally, the Hindus in Varanasi have every right to pursue their case in the courts. And the courts may make a decision one way or another. But if the courts make the decision, nobody will ever be happy with it.
Yeah, it shouldn't come to that.
It should come from society. Now, if it'd be different, it's different in Israel, right? The Al-Aqsa Mosque is built on the Temple Mount. Al-Aqsa Mosque is, in legend, the site from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. This is not just some neighborhood mosque. This is a really important mosque on the ancient site of the Jewish temple, and it was intentionally put on that site because the Jewish temple had been there. And there's no resolution to this. This can't be resolved. But Ayodhya could have been resolved.
Absolutely.
Vishwanath Temple, that can be resolved. These are sites that just aren't that ritually important in the Muslim faith. And I hope Muslim Indians will decide ultimately that they want to resolve these issues peacefully instead of standing on their full legal rights.
Yeah. No, that's a great point that you bring up. One of my grouses is that we relegate too many of these things to political process rather than civil society, where we can have these exchanges between leaders and sort out these differences more amicably.
Or at a more day-to-day level, does a Hindu musical procession have to go by a major mosque, or could it go around? Alternatively, does a neighborhood mosque, have to have loudspeakers for the call to prayer? Couldn't they do the call to prayer the way their ancestors did it, verbally? There's nothing in Muslim tradition that says you have to have electronic loudspeakers at your mosque, right? Both sides could, if they wanted, reach towards a civil understanding based on a mutual desire for brotherhood. Unfortunately, in many cases, it seems like the two sides just don't want that. And that's sad to see. But look, and I want to stress, because when I talk to Westerners, I want to stress every country has these problems.
Right.
This is not something that stops India being a democracy.
Yeah.
This is something that prevents India from having an even more vibrant society than it already does.
Well, this is a tangent that we could go on further, but there are other couple of things that I want to cover before we reach the end of the year. Donald Trump came up a couple of times.
Donald Trump always comes up.
Yeah, so he's been rather popular, or infamous, I should say, over the last couple of months in India. What do you make of these rising tensions between the US and India? Is it just the fact that we have a seat at the big boy table right now? Do you see that as India's rise in prominence, or
I think it's all domestic politics. So to be clear, at the level of defense cooperation and level of strategic planning, everyone in the U.S. government wants India on side, and there's a strong desire to court India. But Mr. Trump himself sees electoral advantage in playing up anti-India fears, and so he's been playing them up in the same way that Narendra Modi sometimes sees electoral advantage in talking about how India will be independent. India is going to build its own supply chains. There will be, and again, on both sides, these are myths. But unfortunately, in democracies, these are myths that have the ability to shape attitudes and ultimately to affect international relations. Donald Trump's recent policy stances vis-a-vis India, whether that's on tariffs or H-1B visas, they're very destructive for his foreign policy agenda. But he feels they're good for his domestic electoral agenda, and that's why we see them.
Is there we certainly sense a broader anti-Indian sentiment in the US, if not the West, right? Where recent incidents where the unfortunate beheading of the motel owner, I think it was in Utah or that sort, and plenty of these incidents.
By an illegal immigrant, let's be, so it wasn't by an American.
There's all this rhetoric about Indians displacing white American jobs, for instance, and so on and so forth. And one could just argue, like you just mentioned, that Trump is just reflecting the aspirations or the expressions of the people, right? He's playing to his base per se.
So first, I'd like to be clear. This is anti-Indian
Yeah,
rhetoric. This is not anti-Indian American rhetoric.
right.
So the people, the Americans who would get those software jobs if Indians were not given those H-1B visas would not be white Americans. Right? They would be mostly Indian and Chinese and other Asian Americans who have the skills to do it. Or to give you another example, recently, and I don't know if this has been reported in India, under the Biden administration, there had been a FBI raid and Department of Justice prosecution of the Swaminarayan Temple in Robbinsville, New Jersey, claiming that they were engaged in slave labor practices and a caste-based oppression. That case has now been dropped by the new Trump Department of Justice as all being fabricated. Right? So Indian Americans are not facing any kind of official pressure or pogrom. If anything, the Trump administration is working hard to attract Indian American voters. But of course, Indian H-1B visa holders don't vote in the United States, and Indians who have to pay a tariff, they don't vote
Do you
in the
think
United
that
States.
level of nuance is possible for, let's say, a person on the street that they see distinctions between an Indian American, perhaps, let's say, like second generation, they see a legally settled Indian,
Yeah,
and then they see someone who's just like come to the US for a particular job on a visa. I mean,
yeah.
do you think that those levels of distinctions are as apparent, or is
No,
it
you're absolutely you're absolutely right. This has the potential to stoke racism and stoke anti-Indian American, anti-Asian American sentiment. There is a lot of anti-Asian American discrimination in the United States. It's not only discrimination by individuals, it's actually official discrimination. So one of the serious problems in the US has been universities giving penalties to applications from Asian Americans because Asian Americans are doing too well on especially math and science, but even in English. I mean, if you look in the United States, all of the spelling bees tend to be won by Indian Americans because Indian Americans study to, and the non-Indian Americans aren't studying to win the spelling bee. So there has been a lot of both official and interpersonal discrimination against Asian Americans. And in fact, on that same Pew survey you mentioned earlier, Asian Americans, we don't have the breakdown for specifically Indian, but Asian Americans report much higher levels of discrimination than Muslim Indians or Sikh Indians or Christian Indians in India report. So anti-Asian American discrimination is serious. That includes both Chinese American and Vietnamese American and Indian American personal discrimination. The sad fact is it's also official discrimination, at least at the state level, when it comes to university admissions in the United States. It's a reality. I don't know what to say other than yes, you're right. It's these high level policy decisions about visas and tariffs have the potential to make anti-Asian discrimination even worse in the United States. But the U.S. is a country with a serious race problem, and it's not only African Americans who face racial discrimination in the U.S.
Last couple of questions before we wind up. Again, thank you so much for being generous with your time.
Thank you for inviting me on. It's fantastic.
How do you see Dharma democracy evolve as we go in the future? Right, as Indians get older, as we get more prominent in world politics, as we get more prosperous, perhaps, and so on. Right. I mean, as technology, of course, changes, the way we live and so on, even more than what it has already. How do you see Dharma democracy evolving going into the future?
Indian democracy is maturing. And people have often heard me criticize Rahul Gandhi and criticize the Indian National Congress. It's not because I'm anti-Congress in any ideological sense. It's because the idea of a family-run party is just very 20th century. I mean, this is no modern developed democratic country has political parties that are run by families. And the regularization of Indian politics is being promoted by the BJP, because the BJP is a modern, meritocratic political party. Now, people might think the BJP's ideology is somehow, not modern. I'm not talking about ideology. I'm talking about party organization. The party is run like a modern bureaucratic organization. Congress isn't. What India needs is to have more parties being run like the BJP is run, not as personal parties of a one big man, not as caste-based parties, but as modern parties like the BJP, like the communists. The communists are a very modern. I know they've split many times, but the various communist parties in India are relatively modern organization parties. And as India continues to see political party modernization, it'll become a more mature democratic system. And I think that's going to happen. I think that the only route forward for the Congress Party is ultimately to divorce itself from the family and become a modern, bureaucratic, meritocratic political party that's not run by a family. That makes India a model for the rest of the developing world, because the rest of the developing world, again, look to Pakistan, look to Bangladesh. They're run by family parties. In the Pakistan case, by the military, but the political parties in Pakistan are family political parties. And that model is not just South Asian. Go to Africa. Parties tend to be either big man parties, one person, or they tend to be families that run the party, or they're the equivalent of a caste-based party. So they're a tribe-based party or a region-based party. What India can teach the rest of the third world is that it's possible to run a modern political party in a relatively poor developing country. And it's possible to build connections across all these lines. What makes the BJP so good for Indian democracy? And again, I want to stress, I'm not endorsing any specific BJP policy. I'm saying the BJP is good for Indian democracy because it takes people from all different language groups, from all different castes, from all different family origins, and brings them together in a set of horizontal linkages where people make connections across these natural divisions. The one thing missing, fundamentally, being a Muslim membership in the BJP, and the BJP has not succeeded. For all its rhetoric around it, it simply has not succeeded in really attracting Muslim Indians into their fold. Well, that example is an example for other developing countries. You can, in the developing country setting, develop political parties that are not clientelistic, but instead are actually modern political parties. And the secret, I think, and thus the title of the book, the secret is a sense of Dharma. Now, other countries are not going to use the word Dharma, but the idea of duty to the nation, the idea that your duty is more important than your right, is something that is potentially appealing all across the traditional societies of the world, in a way that the American model that we've tried to sell repeatedly, unsuccessfully, has not been successful, because we've repeatedly said what's important is your individual rights. Yeah. Well, I believe in individual rights. We have to have those, but you have to have duties as well. And unless you accept your duty to the nation, and it's something that Americans have been doing for so long that we take it for granted. There are very few Americans who don't, like me, feel a very strong sense of duty to their country. We just don't talk about it because it's now consolidated, right? 1865 was the end of our Civil War. And since 1865, that sense of Americanness, of a unified, we're all American, we're all in it together, that's really solidified over the last 200 years, 170 years. That's something India has succeeded at. And it shows that other developing countries can do that as well.
Right. Yeah. One last question before we let you go. If there was an Indian leader that you would, from the past, who you could talk to, who would that be, and what would you ask them?
If we talk about a leader, if we talk about an Indian person, it would be probably Swami Vivekananda. Who wouldn't want to meet Swami Vivekananda? But an actual Indian political leader, I would say Rajendra Prasad. And I know he's not particularly a hero in today's India. Everyone wants to talk about Netaji or Sardar Patel, or there are many more charismatic figures. But Rajendra Prasad was the president of the Constituent Assembly, and he had to take all of these very divergent views and he had to manage Ambedkar. And anyone who's read Ambedkar, or the whole idea that you have to, because Ambedkar drafted the Constitution, he was chair of the drafting committee, and to be the person who has to rein in Ambedkar, keep him on side. You don't want him storming out of the assembly saying, I'm not going to participate in this democracy, while at the same time keeping the very traditional people in. Because remember, what we now call the Congress Party has no connection to the Indian National Congress of 1945, 46, 47. The INC was an umbrella organization. Everyone was in it. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee was a congressman, right? And he was the founder of the Jana Sangh, and later, that morphed into the BJP. So that the Rajendra Prasad played such a, I see it in the Constituent Assembly minutes. What a role he played in just saying enough to keep everyone together. And I would love to know, what happened behind the scenes of all of that. I'm guessing he was probably the great conciliator of India, but I'd love to know more about him, and I'd love to actually just sit down and have the chat and hear the stories. I think it'd be fascinating.
Yeah, that's certainly an interesting choice, for sure. Thank you again, Professor Babones, for being on Bharat Varta and for your insightful commentary on India, especially from someone from the West. It's very rare that we find such incisive and relevant commentary that is also very real and relevant for India. So thank you again, and all the best with the book.
Thank you. It's great to talk to you.